Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I am your host, Heather Shea Gasser from Michigan State University. Today I am talking with the two authors of Generation Z Goes to College, Dr. Corey Seemiller and Meghan Grace. You can participate in today's episode by following along on the back channel and tweeting to our hashtag HigherEdLive. It really helps if you add your comments to this and ask any questions of our guests today. Thanks again to Val Ruska, who is going to be helping me out on the back channel. So in a moment, I'll introduce you to Corey and Meghan, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune into episodes with my good friend and co-host Tony Duty and me on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. If you're unfamiliar with past episodes, we highly recommend that you check out and favorite the archive link that we are tweeting out now. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions and branding, strategy, web design, and more. Calling all marketers and storytellers, M. Stoner is offering a free webinar on May 25th on storytelling to recruit students. Led by CEO and co-founder Voltaire Morin, this session explores stories that resonate with prospective students and their influencers. Using an undergraduate admissions experience map as our guide, we'll review 3 examples of stories targeted specifically toward different stages in the admissions process. Registration is free, and we're tweeting out a link shortly where you can sign up. Student Affairs Live is also exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA believes that Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways that you can be innovative with your own professional development. Do you have fiscal year 2016 funds that you need to spend? Registration for ACPA 2017 in Columbus, Ohio is now opening. We are tweeting out a link now where you can register. All right, now on with today's episode. So as the parent of 2 Generation Z boys, I am keenly interested in and aware of the characteristics of the next generation known as Generation Z, or those born between 1995 and 2010. And generational differences have always greatly interested me. I began reading the Beloit Mindset List nearly 20 years ago, and every year since, I've thought about how my life and experiences going to college so drastically differ from those who are going to college today. On today's episode of Student Affairs Live, I'll be talking with 2 researchers and authors of the book Generation Z Goes to College. I have my copy here today. And over the next hour, we're going to be exploring the unique characteristics of this generation, how college and university organizations, environments, policies, and curriculum can adapt to best meet their needs. So I'm grateful to have Dr. Corey Seemiller, a former colleague of mine from the University of Arizona. Hi, Corey.
Hello.
And Meghan Grace here. Hi, Meghan.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining me today to talk about your research on Generation Z. So we've got a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get started. First, I'd like each of you to tell me a little bit about yourself and include in your response the most interesting or surprising piece of information that you learned while studying Generation Z. Corey, do you want to start?
Sure. So I currently serve as an assistant professor in leadership studies at Wright State University. I've been there about a year, and my former background was I was a director of leadership programs, so I really have a background in leadership and student affairs. And so I will tell you a little bit more about how we got interested in Generation Z, but I've been through 3 different generations in my career, Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z, so it's been a fun transition to watch this. I would say probably one of the most interesting pieces was that I had a thought that Generation Z was going to be a lot like Millennials, that we were going to see many of the same characteristics continue through, and we do to some extent, but the biggest thing was that I noticed that they're a lot more like Gen X. They're more like me, and we'll explore that a little bit more later on. But so they really kind of go back to this sort of independent, sort of responsible yet critical kind of a generation that we saw with Gen X. So I thought that was pretty surprising to me.
Cool. Thanks so much. Meghan, tell us a little bit about you and what you thought was most interesting.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Meghan Grace. I currently serve as the Director of Undergraduate Programming and University Partnerships for Sigma Phi Epsilon Fraternity, so I'm way out in Richmond, Virginia right now. And it's been a really interesting ride, especially as a millennial, and being part of one of the, what they say, the most researched generation, and arguably the most talked about, and whether that's good talk or bad talk. But what I found so interesting is how mature these students are and how constantly amazed at how intelligent they are. And that was never a doubt. I mean, thinking about college students, but at such young ages, the things that they're talking about and the maturity of the way that they see the world and how they interact with the world is like, when I was 18, I was like concerned about going to the beach with my friends. They're like, how are we going to, you know, save the beaches, clean up the environment, and care about the world around us? So it's definitely a different perspective that has been really refreshing to learn more about and have the opportunity to work with these students.
Awesome. I completely agree. I work here at Michigan State with a residential living learning community focused on the environment, and I am continually amazed at the first-year students that come in and their passion. So, Corey, tell me a little bit about, you know, what got you interested, but then also, where did you get the information that you published in this book?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So it was, if we take you back a little bit to the summer of 2013, so I was planning my staff retreat, and I thought something's different. Something in the air is different. I feel like there's some kind of generational change happening. So I looked it up online and found out that we were going to be getting our first official cohort of what would be called Generation Z as our first-year traditional students. And so I put together a little bit of research by looking on Google and talked to my staff about it, and it was kind of interesting. And I had been through the millennial shift in my position, and I saw how that impacted our program, so I wanted to do the same in looking at Gen Z transition. So word got out, and I got an opportunity to present to our Student Affairs Symposium, which is sort of a day-long institute, and I put in a program proposal, and I asked at my staff meeting, I said, you know, is there anybody who'd be interested in co-presenting with me? And, you know, of course, how they all kind of look away real quickly and, you know, have no real interest in doing that. And so, but Megan has said, yeah, me, because Megan at the time was working in my office. And so we partnered up and we presented on basically a lot of the same findings that we had found from market research. And there wasn't really a lot out there because they hadn't come to college yet. So this was in 2013. We presented our session and it was packed. And people loved it, and they had lots of questions. And so we continued to get asked all throughout the year about what do we do about Generation Z this and that. And we decided in the spring of 2014 that it was time to launch our own study. And we basically solicited campuses who were willing to put forth a first-year population of 2014 students who would fall into the Generation Z age range. And we asked them if they would basically forward a survey. We got over 1,200 participants and 15 institutions. So that, and they were public, private, 4-year, 2-year, all over the nation. And we asked qualitative and quantitative questions. And so what was interesting is, although this is a fairly small sample when you consider the national size of our first-year population, what was happening at the same time was Northeastern University was doing a phone poll of Generation Z in fall of 2014. And they were asking many of the same questions we were, which we didn't find out until after we launched our survey. At the same time, UCLA was launching the SERP study that they do every year, and they basically put out their survey, and they had over 150,000 students respond. So we contacted UCLA and asked if they could send us the data set for just Generation Z students, and they said yes. So we were able to get that report. So between our study, Northeastern study, and the SERP study, and then another close to 200 other sources that we had around market research, adolescent research, social science research, Pew, Census, Gallup data, we were able to create a story. And what was neat about it was that our study was the only one that really collected the qualitative data. So our book, which is a compilation of the quantitative findings, really also tells the stories from the words of Generation Z, which we were able to capture in our study. So really, it's a collection of what was available at the time in terms of who these students really are.
Awesome. I loved reading the quotes. I think that's one of the highlights as well, because it does kind of put the words to exactly what their experience is. So let's get into some of the content and what specifically marks this generation is different from. And Corey, I know that generations are often shaped by significant events and societal contexts. And given that Generation Z may or may not identify or maybe have heard of but didn't exactly experience some of the same things that have occurred in the lifetimes of other generations, how might this lack of understanding or different understanding and context affect our ability to connect with, communicate, or just simply relate to them when we talk about something like the Challenger disaster or Matthew Shepard, in particularly that you mentioned in the book?
Right. Yeah. This to us was a really important piece, because trying to figure out who Generation Z was without a context made it really hard to say why they might be the way that they are. You know, I think back, I know exactly where I was the day that the Challenger exploded. My mom knows where she was the day that JFK was shot. I mean, these are significant events. And I think about 9/11, and that didn't happen too long ago in my mind. I mean, I was a professional. I mean, I had been out of grad school for a while. It seems like it wasn't too long ago. Yet the oldest of these students were actually kindergartners at the time. So their context of things that are shaping the world with which we live today is just so different. They didn't see the recession happen, but they felt it happen. They watched their friends' parents and their parents maybe lose jobs and homes. They've never really had the promise of a guaranteed job after college, where millennials might have had that because we had such a great economy at the time, whereas now, you know, these students are saying, I don't know if I'm going to get a chance to work because of the recession, and we're coming out of it, and you're seeing us come out of it, but that's not the world they grew up in. You know, and you think about these, I was just commenting the other day, you know, these kids, most of them are not going to ever have chicken pox. I mean, so just some of the things that we make references to, even when we're just communicating with them, don't sometimes make sense to them. And so we have to, in some ways, keep up with current events that they connect with so we can relate to them, but also take the time to explain the implications of some of the more historical events that are shaping the times they live in. Why is their experience at an airport the way it is? Well, let's talk about that. Let's have a real conversation about why things are the way they are. But what you'll see is that this generation, like I had mentioned before, is a little bit more realistic, a little bit more kind of independent, a little bit, even in some senses, critical, because they sort of have this black cloud floating over the last 10 years, where we see with housing and the economy and terrorism and school shootings and things that are just scary. They're told that the world is scary, and they see that around them, and then if they don't experience it themselves, they can get online and watch it really happen, watch videos of it and hear testimonials. And so this is how they're coming to us in college. They're coming to us saying, I'm not sure I'm going to get a job because I watched good people lose theirs, and I'm scared, and I might be scared to go to school. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing when I think about those students showing up and unloading their packages in their rooms and all excited, and that is the case with them, but there's a sense of reality that undergirds their entire experience when they come to us.
Yeah. So you talked about kind of the residual effects of these things that happen in our generations that they may peripherally experience. Can you talk about some specific events or experiences that have shaped this generation the most, that within the last couple of years that you think have been highlighted?
You know, I would say anytime that there's been a school shooting, I'd probably say some of those, and I wouldn't even say one, I would say the multiple continual pieces of that. I will tell you one that I think is going to shape them that hasn't happened yet, and that's going to be the presidential election. I think we have yet to see that monumental experience for this generation, and I think the presidential election might serve that, or what comes from that. But you know, we haven't seen necessarily the Hurricane Katrina of this generation. We haven't seen, you know, the Haiti. We haven't seen those kinds of things yet. The Exxon Valdez oil spills of the generation. But you know, as they emerge and they get older, we're going to start seeing some real critical pieces that are going to shape them. Because right now they're feeling the after effects of events that happen to us.
Yeah. So let's just shift a little bit to talking a little bit about how they learn about these things, because I think in the third chapter of the book you talk a lot about the communications platforms and their preferences. And Megan, I think as a parent myself of two Generation Z kids, I am amazed at their adeptness with, constant use of, and inability to turn off their technology. So how do we kind of as educators balance this fear of missing out, which I also have, right? So I relate to. How do we help balance that with also kind of their desire to turn it off?
Yeah, I think it comes down to beyond just an acceptance of the fact that they use it, but finding ways, I can't speak as a parent, but as an educator, finding ways to integrate it into the experience and not taking away that tool. They don't view it as a distraction as older generations might. They view it as just how they've always lived their life and how they've always accomplished things. So even, you know, basic communication of connecting with a friend or family member to ordering something on Amazon, like mind-blowing. If you would have asked 10 years ago if you could get something delivered to your house in 2 days because you ran out of like Tide to do laundry, you can push a button and do that. So I think it's a matter of being in the role that we are with being educators of finding ways to understand the technology they're using, understanding the appeal, and then integrating that the best that we can. Things like polls within our classrooms, beyond just the clickers. I know text polling is becoming a huge aspect in integrated classrooms and educational settings, but beyond that, creating the space for there to be real value of that face-to-face communication, where they're going to realize, I should be unplugging and tuning in person in that experience. And so, meeting them where they are, but then also sometimes just having that pointed conversation of, this is our time, like let's turn off a little bit for a little while and focus in, and having that conversation, because I think sometimes we swing to one end of the spectrum or not, where it's fully integrated, fully aligned, and then we fully disconnect them. So how can we find that middle space of sometimes we're going to be off our phones, but other times like it's going to be a necessary aspect of the experience that we're about to have. So being understanding in that regard, I think it's a conversation that I even have with my mom when she's like trying to talk to her grandkids who happen to be Generation Z. She's like, oh man, I tried to put this off for so long, but you have to teach me how to use this iPad. And I was like, yeah, Mom, I can do that. She's like, I guess your nephews are on Facebook now, and now I have to connect with them there. And I was like, yep, you're probably gonna have to do that. So I think it's going to be one of those things where we can't keep technology at an arm's length anymore. We kind of have to bring it in a little bit.
Yeah, I like what you said about integrating, because I think what I've noticed is that sometimes it's not saying it's all the way off or all the way on, but maybe it's giving a YouTube break, right? Like go watch whatever Dan TDM video, and my kids are a little younger, right, the college students, but that you missed, because I had you turn it off earlier in the day, or find a way to integrate that. So that makes a lot of sense. So the other aspect of social media, I think, and sometimes I struggle with this, with also being within those channels with my students, is the TMI factor. They use this to share aspects of their lives. And I was interested to read in your book that Generation Z may be more interested in keeping some of their social lives private and not using social media in the same way as previous generations to kind of broadcast. So how can we as educators talk a little bit about social media branding and presence, and thinking about the impact that might have on their reputations within a collegiate context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's something to be said about, again, not being completely private and you have no digital footprint. Like marking that clean is almost to raise a red flag, but at the same time, our employers are going to be online. LinkedIn has been a huge advent to that, and helping them utilize those skills that they can wield online for kind of building that professional presence, but even just their personal presence online and how that impacts their potential professional nature. That's a conversation that we have with students often of, if you're putting it online, you know that you can access just about anything online, so can anyone else. So having that really pointed conversation and talking about social media presence, but I think it's also been an interesting aspect that they've seen people like celebrities where social media leaks happen, and it does ruin an element of their personal and professional presence. So utilizing those examples of that can be important. I think relying on their ability to learn social media, but then providing the context that we know of, your identity is no longer online and in person. Those are starting to very much so blend together, which I think is a unique aspect for college students today, is they're never just online or just offline, and how they are online is going to reflect their in-person reality, and they try to have those be two different things, but I think they're starting to realize that professionals and instructors and their advisors on campus are also living in that space, which is something that was, I think, very different for millennials, where they could put just about anything on Facebook at the time when it was only for college students, and so it was that place where you could kind of cut loose it and have a very different personality there than you would in person. So it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had, but I think as advisors and supervisors and instructors working with students, helping them start to manage that online identity is important.
Yeah, definitely. There's a great resource that I'm aware of because a couple of my colleagues helped co-author it with Eric Qualman, the book "What Happens on Campus Stays on YouTube," and talks about the scary parts, but also talks about maybe some strategies for failing forward. If you do something, what is it? What do you do to kind of recover from that and learn from that as well? So I was thinking about this because, Corey, I think you and I both kind of identify as Gen Xers, and the parents, my kids are younger now, but I think the parents of most of our students who are Gen Z are Gen Xers. So what do we need to know about how Gen Xers interact with a collegiate environment to be the best resource, and also considering them as partners, parents as partners with student affairs?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, and it was interesting because we look so much at Generation Z and then thinking about the influence of Gen X as their parents on who they are today, but really kind of thinking, what do the Gen X parents mean for colleges today? Because that's different than the parents of millennials. The parents of millennials were primarily baby boomers, and you know, they've been dubbed the helicopter parents who fly overhead and make decisions, you know, for their students, and we've had to create parent and family programs and all sorts of ways to engage these parents of millennials because their helicopter parents wanted to be involved. And so when we look at Gen Z and their parents primarily being Gen X, do we continue with that same approach? And it's interesting because when you look at over time, students' views of their parents as role models, it goes higher and higher, starting with Gen X, then it goes up for millennials, and then it's very high for Gen Z. They view their parents as their number one role models. They are their friends, their advisors, their mentors. They go to them for everything. So instead of being a helicopter parent, we've called them co-pilots because they are being invited into the seat with the students themselves to co-make decisions. So what does that mean for colleges? It probably still means heavily involved parents, but in ways that their students want them to be involved. So as you imagine, we've seen things like orientations where we have one track for the students and one track to keep the parents occupied, right, and give them the information that they need. And the students don't necessarily want to blend with their parents per se. We may find that an integrated orientation program might be a good approach where these students can have access to their parents right there. They want to have access, and my mind is, you know, oh, well, you should be making these decisions on your own. You're breaking free. You should decide your classes. But that's not the reality. The reality is I also consulted other people when I picked classes, whether it was friends or not. So why don't we give them access to the people who they trust the most and think about how do we incorporate the parents in a way that is with their students rather than next to their students, right? You got the parent magazine and the student magazine. You got, you know, everything's sort of separate. But if we integrated it all, is there a way to find a way to incorporate parents as a real player in higher education? So I think that we're going to see no less parental involvement. We're just going to see their needs are going to be different. And I don't think it's going to be Gen X that's going to call out those needs. I think it's going to be the students themselves that are going to request their parents are at certain things or be able to participate in activities with them. And I just think in some ways we need to be open to that. You know, we want to make sure that there's a healthy split between independence, but also making sure that we understand that these are really important advisors for them. And if they don't feel like they have access to these advisors and mentors to make important decisions, they might not make those decisions or might not want to be in an environment that prevents them from doing so.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is that we, 2 months prior to first-year students arriving on our campuses, they were required to have their parents sign permission slips to do anything, right? And so within like a very short period of time, we're now saying you can't talk to your parents about anything. I mean, that's a process. So that transition process, I think, really changes. I was having this conversation with a parent, and they were like, "You don't understand. Last week I signed a parent permission slip." This was at orientation. And so I think you're right. I think an integrative approach and maybe a longer-term transition process makes sense. And as an involved parent myself, I kind of get that. I get that need to be involved, and I also see my kids wanting me to be involved too, which may change over time. Who knows? So I was also reading through the chapter on social change and engagement, and as I mentioned, with the students that I work with here at MSU, they're definitely interested in making the world a better place. Can you talk a little bit about the ways that you found Generation Z students want to go about making change? Is it traditional political processes, volunteerism, social engagement? Like, what are the ways that they're going to do this?
Well, when you asked the earlier question about what was one of our, most surprising findings or interesting findings, for me, the other one was that Generation Z sees social change rather than service. And this is a real shift. If you look at the growth of service learning and volunteer centers and, any kind of these offices or programs on campuses, you're going to see that they have grown exponentially in the last 15 years. And that is mostly because of the interest of and desire to serve millennials who were coming out of high school with high service requirements, participation, and to be able to have them come into college and be able to continue that, capture that. We know that it's a great way to learn. We know it's a great way to serve the community, which is part of institutional mission statements. So you have all these programs, and millennials would sign up and they go for once a month to a food bank and serve food or whatever it might be that they would do, and they were really often short-term volunteer opportunities in an established location. Well, Generation Z, one of the first things that was interesting is when I first presented this a couple years ago, I was presenting to a group of folks at Leadership Educators Institute, and I was talking about that Generation Z is not really all that interested in this short-term volunteerism. They didn't really like it in high school. They felt like they had to do it. They come to college and they don't really have an intention. Many of them, there are some that do, but many of them don't see that that's their major contribution to helping communities. So I was talking about this, and it was interesting. After the session was over, I had a line of people waiting to talk to me, and I was just wondering what they wanted, and almost all of them were talking about, this makes sense now why my alternative break isn't filled, my volunteer programs aren't filled. This is the first year in the last maybe 10, 15 years that I haven't had a waiting list. And I said, I'm wondering if we're offering what these students want. How they see themselves changing and impacting their communities is not the way that we have structurally set up programs that were designed originally for mostly millennial students. And so these students are very social change oriented. They want to address the cause of the problem, not the symptoms. So instead of going and spending 5 hours at a food bank, they want to eradicate hunger. And what are our volunteer programs and our service learning programs doing to help them work towards addressing the problem and not addressing the symptom? Now again, addressing the symptom is highly important. Doing service is highly important. This is where I'm suggesting that we don't do an either or, we do an and. So for the students who want to do short-term service and volunteerism, we give them opportunities to do that. But we add programs that help students identify underlying causes of problems, talk about how to create sustainable change, whether that's a cultural shift in the mindset of the people who are affected by the issue or political change, legal change, and we help them understand how to do that because they are craving it and they want to create change. Now, what we found that was also interesting is that a lot of them are fairly disengaged in the political process. You're kind of seeing this a little bit with the primaries already. You see that there's not a huge youth support going out for the election right now, and the real youth support is for Bernie Sanders. And if you look at the age group, it's still mostly in millennials that are just a little bit older. And so you're not seeing like a huge youth movement like you did for Obama in 2008. And so these students don't necessarily see politics as the way to create change. As a matter of fact, many of them had some choice words to say about it, that it's dysfunctional, it's corrupt, and that they have no interest in participating in it. And so what's interesting, though, is when we ask them about creating change and how they want to impact their communities, a lot of them saw things like entrepreneurship as being a very viable way to create change, invention. So instead of working in politics, per se, and creating a law that curbs carbon emissions, they're just going to build a car that has no carbon emissions. Or or they may end up creating a business that somehow serves the community in a way that addresses carbon emissions. So that they're really seeing themselves as entrepreneurial. Many of them want to work for themselves when they graduate. They don't necessarily want to work for a company. And they want to be able to change the world through coming up with creative inventions. And so it's going to be interesting to watch as the first cohort of them graduates in a couple of years to see if they really wanted that and if they really do that. But really how they're seeing themselves engaging is this long-term sustainable engagement that addresses really kind of from a business perspective or an entrepreneurial perspective or even a scientific and innovative perspective about. To me, that was absolutely fascinating, having worked in civic engagement for so long, is how do we expand the definition of community engagement to include things like innovation, technology creation to address social issues, social entrepreneurship, those kinds of things.
That is fascinating. I mean, that speaks to why programs that are interdisciplinary focused and bringing students together across different ideas with kind of a longer term engagement level are really attracting a number of students versus those kind of one-off done in a day activities. That's fascinating. What you also said about political engagement is fascinating to me, and my concern, of course, is that who's going to run in 20 years if they're viewing politics as dysfunctional. How are we going to continue to perpetuate the cycle that we currently have in the system?
Yeah, that I think is the million-dollar question, because again, if we don't engage these students to see politics as a viable and important element of our community and our democracy, then you're right, who is going to run? Are we going to skip a generation? I mean, this is a huge generation. We're talking about a number of people that we'd be sort of skipping, and I don't think we'd be absent of them running for office, but certainly we need to start looking at the long-term view of politics, not just the short-term view, is how do we sustain our interest in politics for those generations coming after us, because millennials are also highly dissatisfied with politics, yet their way of engaging was trying to get candidates elected who they did support. Generation Z is not doing that, and that can be somewhat concerning. But what's interesting about it is that although they might not be interested per se in politics, they're super good at raising money. And many of them have worked on campaigns to raise money for initiatives and candidates. And so they're not completely disengaged necessarily from politics altogether. They're sort of disengaged from the voting element of it, which I find interesting. But they'll raise money for a candidate. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out, and following it very closely with this upcoming election, because I think this is going to set the tone for what's to come with this group.
Awesome. That's really interesting. So, Megan, I want to shift to talking a little bit about our academic and co-curricular learning environments. So many of our environments in our campuses, both in and outside of the classroom, are built upon this notion of interpersonal connection. So we do a lot of discussions and group work and all of those kinds of things. How can we infuse intrapersonal learning more into the curriculum to better align with the preferences of Generation Z that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, so thinking about, we rely heavily, like you said, on this idea of group work with students. However, when we're talking about Generation Z, they actually prefer to be able to kind of go on this journey of like figuring things out on their own for a little while, which I think is very characteristic of if they're going to do any online research, it's by themselves. They're very apt to be able to find information, take in information. So it's going to change the way that we might structure assignments or those experiences of can they do work individually before they come to class, and almost flip those experiences where they still very much so value the interpersonal aspect of the learning environment, but it's more so of I'm going to work with my peers to validate that I've learned this or as a tool to further that knowledge, but they do prefer to take in that foundational knowledge on their own, which is very interesting because they're doing that via video. So they're most using video platforms to take in information. You've probably seen a lot on like Facebook feeds of even things as simple as a recipe or a quick snippet about a current event, but that's how they're taking in information. So it's not surprising that they prefer to also do learning aspects of schoolwork even online. They're using things like Khan Academy and online platforms and modules to learn things and to self-pace. So I think it's going to be interesting, again, so we don't swing too far and completely just make it an individual aspect of learning, but almost like they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting on their own and then bringing that to the class and integrating that with the social learning of that. But that's also how they kind of view their instructors is their instructors, they find them valuable, they want them to be credible, but almost more of a facilitator of knowledge, less of a pontification, I'm going to stand in front of the room and spew knowledge at you for an hour when they could have found that online by themselves. So I think it's going to change the nature of the traditional classroom and our co-curricular programs, that they're not just going to go to a workshop and listen to a speaker when they could potentially find that information or a video of that speaker online. So it's going to change kind of the appeal of that. I think is going to be really interesting. And this idea of reflection, I think, moving back to kind of an old school way of learning, but the interpersonal reflection aspect of it. People love to talk about themselves. So thinking about self-pacing, self-reflection in ways that they can utilize those individual experiences within that. So building in those times, I think, is going to be important in educational experiences.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the ways that you talked in the book about how students will have access immediately to their phones, right, during class, and they'll fact check a professor or go find the information. So I think your point about integrating technology into the learning environment, also considering that kind of pre-learning on their own makes a lot of sense. But lamenting kind of the loss of group work, I think, also brings me talking about these students' experiences with diversity, right? Diversity in quotes, because I think Generation Z's exposure to differences and values of diversity as you talk about pretty extensively, is very different, right? So does this change, Corey, can you talk a little bit about how this changes our approach in offering diversity experiences for students once they get to college? Are they already open, inclusive, affirming, or do we need diversity training and experiences to take them to that next level?
Yeah, this is a fantastic thing to think about, because really there were another study, not our own study, found that this generation is the most diverse with the most diverse social circles than any generation in documented history in the United States. And so thinking about that, what does that mean? It means that these students grew up with lots of people who were different from them, and lots of opportunities to celebrate those differences. Like I think about growing up, and there was no way we would have a gay-straight alliance in my high school. But now many high schools is sort of the norm in many ways. And so not only were there opportunities to have people who were different than you be your friends, but there were also organizations that supported and celebrated differences in ways that I didn't experience necessarily when I grew up. And so we think about they're coming to college with a different sense of what difference means. And not that all of them are open-minded, not that all of them know how to be inclusive. However, I do think that they're coming with an expanded idea of diversity than when my generation came to college or when millennials came to college, is that sometimes we end up doing programs that I think might be a little bit more introductory, that may help some students, but I think there's other students that want to go a little bit further than just saying, okay, I understand that people around me are different and that's important. A lot of them get that already. They know that because they've got friends that are really different. They come from, a lot of these students are multiracial, or they have two moms, or they grew up in an immigrant family. I mean, so we're sort of telling them what they already know in many cases. And so the question is, how do we shift that to, okay, we know that differences are important. Now what do we do to ensure that everybody has access to and support in being different? What does that mean? What does that look like? And so we're seeing that sort of the issues of today, they're seeing a lot of movement around the legalization of same-sex marriage. That was a huge one for them. That was probably one of the bigger movements they've seen. You're seeing a lot of things around trans rights. You're seeing things around the balance with religious freedom. Those things they want to know how they can make places more inclusive of differences and not just celebrate differences. And I think that again, it's not an either or. It's an and. We don't necessarily get rid of, diversity programs per se, but these students come in a lot of times wanting to say, what do I do next? How do I create that change? How do I do something really meaningful? And so when we think about it, what are we doing to offer more social justice programs? How are we getting them to learn how to advocate? And again, for a generation that's sort of disenchanted with the political process and knowing that that's a huge way to make change, we might have to use that as the vehicle to re-engage them in politics if they know that they're going to create sustainable change around social justice, which they passionately care about.
That's interesting because, reflecting back on what you said earlier about not wanting to just address a symptom, but wanting to address the underlying problem, like kind of what I hear you saying is that it's one thing to just have everybody be different, but it's another thing to dismantle the structural and systematic oppression that's creating differences in power and access and all of that. So that seems a little bit more in line and maybe really result in the change versus just adding more of whoever to the group is maybe not as effective.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because this is a group that's really not interested per se in traditional boycotts, and you're going to see things like Black Lives Matter happening in pockets, and that may very well take off. But they're really seeing this idea of creating this change is working around the system that exists and dismantling, like you were saying. And what is so fascinating about it is even students who identify as politically conservative are actually very social justice oriented. Many of them are. And so you're finding that even the ones most politically conservative are supporting trans rights, LGBTQ issues. You're seeing things where this group of students is almost in some ways not going to put up with non-inclusive policies and practices anymore, no matter what side of the fence they fall on politically. They kind of socially embrace progressivism regardless of their political affiliation.
That's fascinating. So we had a great question from Twitter, so I'm going to shift to that. It's I think a good kind of segue. Anybody who's watching today, if you have questions, please tweet them to us, and we'll try to incorporate them into our flow. So Carrie Grogan asks the question, do you have any insight on Generation Z's perceived lack of commitment, and how do I get them to show up, in all caps? I understand that concern. So do either of you want to respond to that?
Yeah. So I've gotten this question before when we've worked with groups of how do we get kids to show up, and it kind of draws back to we started to focus in on what motivates them. And the three things that stuck out is they're very relationally motivated. So, and not in the sense of like, I want to make friends, but I want to make an impact on someone. I want to make a difference for somebody. Or the aspect of they want to advocate on something they believe in. So there's got to be a stronger tie in there. But it's also not surprising that one of the things we're most concerned about is financial security and the cost of higher education. So we're probably going to see more of these students working. So how can we balance out that layer of their life with other elements of their involvement? While also thinking about the third thing that they were most motivated by was this idea of a way, like a unique opportunity for advancement or career preparation or preparing for their future. So really making those opportunities or experiences a really overt, direct tie-in to what is the benefit for them being there. Is there any sort of professional development aspect of that? Is that clear of the value that's being portrayed of this experience? So it's not that they don't care. I think it's a matter, or they're not committed to things, but almost how almost like what's in it for them, making that really clear, because it might not be come meet new friends. That's probably not a thing that they're super concerned about, but come make an impact on the community in an issue you care about, probably going to go farther with them. Or here's a great opportunity to learn something in XYZ field if you're thinking about going into that field. So making those really clear.
Cool. So let's move on to talking a little bit more about information literacy, because this kind of relates back to our communication preferences as well. And I see this with my son, right? So I can just Google anything that I want to know about, and whatever is printed online is truth, right? So how do we help students unlearn or relearn, perhaps kind of be more distinguishing connoisseurs of what's printed online? So that even as they receive their information in these kind of snippets, they're able to kind of differentiate between what is maybe legit or worthy of citing in a paper or something like that. Megan, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I think back to when I was first year student in college and you had to go through that library training of how to use the online resources. It never occurred to me that I could use like a different article written by like Huffington Post for an article or something that's a little bit more mainstream. However, these students are very in tune with being able to find information online. So instead of having that course with their library about how to use their online resources, we might need to start having conversations about, yeah, you have access to those online resources, but what fully makes that a credible source? Who is it coming from? If it's from The Onion, we need to recognize it might actually be an opinion piece or a satire piece, so helping them recognize the different types of information that are out there, because we're almost in a situation of there's so much media that it's becoming saturated, and trying to help them recognize the different types of writing, resources, and information out there. Is it truly a satire piece, or is this a piece that is fully opinion-based? And does that really fully connect to your article? So they're great at finding that information, but now we have to help them almost sift through and filter what's actually viable for an academic setting or something that's going to tie into a project. So I think that's really important, and the way that they take in information is very quick and in snippets. So even if they're watching a quick news clip, we might have to have conversations about, okay, well, there's ability to manipulate what kind of information is being portrayed there. Like, we need to think a little further or potentially find another resource regarding this topic. So the encouragement of going a little bit farther or finding more supporting information.
Great. So thinking also about Gen Z, moving through college and into the workforce, what did you learn in your study about, what they might be like as employees and how we might want to think about, not only preparing our current generations for working with Gen Z, but, working with Gen Z folks on how to work within a workforce. Megan, you want to talk a little bit about that, preparing them differently?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really exciting. The oldest of this generation are going to be traditional age college or college seniors next year. So when we think about that, we've got a year before the oldest ones get into the workforce post-college, and I'm sure some of them are already starting to get into that arena. So that conversation is definitely at the forefront of our minds. We started to adapt some of the stuff that had been done regarding how they view role models and why they view certain people as role models, and it's usually the people that are closest to home for them. So parents, teachers, community, not necessarily community leaders, but think like teachers and advisors, people very close to their inner circle. So I think it'll be interesting as we can apply what they like about those role models to, say, supervisors in the workplace. And it's a lot of credibility and transparency of information. So they look at leaders as people who are providing them enough information. They're engaged in the conversation. So I think that's going to be very indicative of how they want to work. They want to be at the table. They want to be a part of the process. I think they're going to work very hard, and they're going to know that they're going to have to work for things that they deserve, but they also want to be engaged in the conversation. It's a matter of almost avoiding this idea that just because they're younger, they don't know things. They're very, very intelligent. They definitely have things to learn, but they also have a lot of insight to provide and maybe a fresh perspective. So I think that's going to be possibly a bit of a shift of, instead of that hierarchy in some organizations of our upper to and middle managers are the keepers of that information and might not get disseminated down to some of the newer employees. I think is going to be important that if we want to engage them, they want to work with credible and transparent leaders that engage them in the conversation and decision making.
Great. So another question related to campus policies came in through Twitter. Leslie Bell asks about how Gen Z can help end sexual assault on campus. And kind of that's a topic that I think a lot of administrators who are watching the show today are really interested in. So any thoughts on that, or did that come up at all in your research?
I think oh, go ahead, Corey.
Oh, no, go ahead, Megan.
Well, I was going to say that they're, again, with their ability to take in information and have those conversations on topics that seemed really far away, I think they're far more aware of, I hate to say it, but dangers on campus, that having these conversations with students, I think, is going to, might not necessarily be easier, but more welcomed. And like I said, they want to be engaged in conversations. They want to be engaged in problem solving. So I think when we talk about sexual assault on campus, including those students in that conversation, something that we've found really successful in having conversations in my workplace working with SIGEP is starting the grassroots conversation, providing discussion questions for them, and letting that peer-to-peer conversation take place, because it is something that generally happens on the college campus that is peer-to-peer. So involving them in the conversation, not necessarily prescribing down a policy, but helping them create that policy and start to create that grassroots movement that's going to most impact themselves and the people close to them.
Corey, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and I think Megan really hit it on the head. It isn't really about how can we help them do it. It's how do we create the space for them to not just end sexual assault on campus, but hazing, binge drinking. We could fill this in with any number of campus issues. And the question is, how do we create actual intentional learning experiences that capture the motivation and desire for students to create change, but doing it on our own campuses? And when we do a lot of projects like volunteer work and service work, what we've set up is for the students to go outside of campus to impact larger communities. And when we think about it, if we created more experiences where students could create change on campus, and that was the program, we could have them addressing issues that are really important, this issue and many others that are important to each campus, where students can come up with ways to do that and then structurally make changes on campus. Not only could it be more sustainable, but it would be a little bit easier in a segmented, smaller place. But again, I think I agree with Megan, is that we have to help students drive this conversation on what's realistic. And I'm not sure that Gen Z can end sexual assault on campus. Every generation asks this question, but I think if we engage in the process of framing this as a social change issue, that we need to culturally and structurally change how campus works so that things, dangerous and risky behavior doesn't take place, because the students call themselves out on it and they hold themselves accountable, then I think we're going to be making some headway there. And I think that this generation is interested in those kind of conversations, and so if we can create programs around that, I think that that would be a really great start.
Yeah, underlying issue again, addressing rape culture and dismantling that, I think, is a good thing to tackle as far as social change. So many of us who are watching are student affairs folks who advise students, supervise students, coach, teach, conduct leadership programs and seminars. So based on your research and on the findings from all the studies, can you talk a little bit about what are the best ways to do all of those things for Generation Z and in ways that best work for them? Cora, do you want to start with that?
Well, one of the findings too that came up for us in our study that was really interesting is that the preferred method of communication for this generation is still face-to-face. They love face-to-face interaction. And so as we think about moving a lot of things online, right, these chats and the virtual this, and those are great because it does expand service, but not doing it in lieu of the real face-to-face, the one-on-one meetings that happen each week with your student organization president, or whatever it might be. They crave that authentic interaction, and just because they text and they're online all the time doesn't mean that that's what they want solely. And we have to keep that in mind. So when we're working with them, is having that face-to-face is really what they want, but it's also what they need. I mean, we can't send them out into the workforce to have no social skills either. And so being able to work with them kind of one-on-one or even in groups, don't abandon the retreat in the mountains if you have that. There are times to turn it off, and helping them understand and balance that. And so I think that that's going to be a critical piece. The other piece is, and this has always been a challenge when I've looked at the last two generations, is in one sense, we as educators need to think about how do we kind of shift, change, adapt, and open our eyes to this other group of students coming in, and how do we embrace them and leverage them in ways that are going to help them exceed and excel in college. But at the other end of the spectrum, we also need to prepare them that they're going out into a world in which they're not going to be interacting very closely with their peers all the time, and that they need to know how baby boomers are going to expect them to work, and how Gen X is going to supervise them, and millennials are going to work with them. And so as much as we want to create an environment that's just Gen Z friendly, which we're advocating for, at the same time we also need to ground it in a reality that they are not living in a Gen Z world. They're living in a multi-generational world in which they're going to have to learn strategies. They're going to have to know that sometimes they have to turn it off, or they can't, sit and text while they're talking to their boss. It's just not going to work. There's certain things that we're going to have to help them understand. Group work. They might want to reflect and think first, but not everything is going to allow them to have the time to reflect and think before they do group work. You got to get into it. So we're going to have to give them those skills to be able to cope and excel in the kind of the post-college world, beyond just appeasing to who they are. So I think there's going to be a real fine balance in what that looks like.
I think the other question I have related to collegiate environments has to do with some of your findings in the book are related to costs of education, and customizing the experience and appealing to what they need is directly tied in some ways to this. I'm paying for this. I'm paying a lot of money for this experience. So can you talk a little bit about how institutions can value the market or value the college degree and talk about marketing that value? Particularly given the high cost that students are paying to be here?
Yeah, absolutely. Colleges have been around for centuries, and we kind of expect that they'll probably be around for centuries more. And but we can't really rest on our laurels because we've shifted from a service economy to an idea economy. And services you train people for, ideas you don't. And so when students are coming to college, it used to be, in some ways, in the early days, college was a well-rounded individual in the humanities, and then it shifted more into some professionalization kind of pieces. And now we're shifting back to training people for professions that aren't going to pay them enough to pay off their student debt. Someone who has to get a 4-year degree to be a teacher who's never going to pay off their student loan in the course of teaching, in a lifetime. So we're going to potentially run students out of low-paying professions if we're requiring degrees and not giving them a path to that. Or we're going to be driving people into professions that don't require degrees. You're looking at lots of technology fields. I actually just read an article that was the 5 top professions that don't require a college degree that make over $80,000 a year. This is what colleges are competing with. Now I believe in the value of college. I have a degree in higher ed. I've worked in higher ed my whole career. I think college is fantastic. But I'm not sure that a 17-year-old right now knows what I believe to be true as their truth as well. So if colleges want to stay in existence and we can't find a way to make it more affordable, then we certainly have to make it more appealing in terms of the value that it has long-term in someone's personal life, whether that's who they're going to be and their ability to navigate the world, their professional desires, that it's going to just make them have more networks to be able to get higher paying positions. We have to be able to create a value statement for them that's more than just everybody goes to college, which is this, and we know everybody doesn't, but it's the thing to do. It's got to be more than that. We have to say, here's the empirical evidence about what college can do for you, and here's how we can help. And then I know enough as a recruiter about my programs to tell you about how your passions fit in with my institution. You're passionate about animal welfare? Well, let me tell you, we have a degree in public administration, and we have students in this degree who have been doing work in an animal care shelter. I mean, it means really retooling what we think about and we communicate, because these students want to know that their passions are going to be supported and developed when they get to college. They're not coming to college, a lot of them, to find their passions. I mean, some are, but some are coming to explore their passions. So how do we get them connected and tell them that college is valuable? And I think that that's going to require quite a bit of new messaging.
Yeah, which I think is a great follow-up. We have several other channels on Higher Ed Live and Marketing Live and Advancement Live and Admissions Live. May want to pick up this topic in particular because I think there's some really relevant and important messages there as well. So we are nearly to the end of our time, so I'd like to end with final thoughts and additional resources for the folks who are watching today, and as well as those who are watching this as a recording. What else would you recommend folks look at if they want to learn more about Generation Z? And we'll try to link all of these or share them in a way that folks, whether you're watching live or watching the recording, can access. Megan, do you want to start first?
Yeah, I mean, first, great place to start is our book. We could spend hours and hours and hours talking about this, but it is such a great foundation to really start that conversation beyond just people working in higher education, anyone really working with Generation Z students. My mom, who is nowhere near working in higher education, has read it and said, I finally understand my nephew, or like her grandchildren. And I was like, well, I'm glad I could help with that, Mom. So it really is, it does open up that conversation. We do have our website, genzgoes2college.com, where we're kind of curating some of our blog posts. Corey does some great stuff with some LinkedIn posts, kind of furthering that conversation as well. And we are on Twitter, so if you have been live tweeting, we have a Twitter handle. You can follow us at Gen Z College, and where we like to retweet and reach out to our friends we want to further this conversation. That's really that started this whole journey with Generation Z, is we wanted to know more and we knew we weren't alone. So Twitter, website, book, great places to start in terms of the conversation that we're having and that we've started. Corey, got anything?
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is that Megan and I have a research agenda that's going to comprise much of our lifetimes. But it's kind of funny because I was like, well, we got job security. It'll be like Gen Z goes into mid-management. Gen Z retires. We have plenty of books to come. But one of the things that we're interested in doing, and of course we always like to do the work that we do in partnership with interested people, campuses that might be interested, is we have a project that we're going to be launching in the next 6 months or so that Megan and I are going to flesh it out a little bit more, but it's going to be a stories project. And we've had a lot of people ask us to disaggregate this information to specific groups, and we have requests for everything from student athletes to first generation students. And we definitely see a value in that, although when you look at a generation as a whole, disaggregating doesn't actually look at the generation as a whole. So we chose to do more of the generational description, but we do think that there's quite a value in the disaggregation, and so we're going to look at maybe collecting stories from different segments of different populations of students in higher education. Some of them that, again, fraternity and sorority members and their perceptions of things, and create some small resources that people might have if they want to specifically look at a population and what those students are saying. It won't be really empirical. It's not intended to be entirely scientific, but at the same time, it will provide some stories right from the the perspectives of those students. And so we're looking for anyone who's interested in maybe working with us on this, who might have a link to a particular population. You work with student athletes on your campus, you work with fraternities and sororities, community college students, letting us know through our website. You can find our contact information, and let us know if you're interested. We're keeping right now a kind of a comprehensive list of everybody who said that they want to partner with us on future projects. And so if you have an interest in having your students involved in this project or even any of our future research, please reach out to us. We would love, love, love to include your students' perspectives.
Awesome. Great. Well, I really highly recommend everybody pick up a copy of this book. It was a great resource for me, and I'm planning on handing it around to folks in my office as well. So thank you to both of you for spending the last hour with us. Lots of great resources and information. Thanks always to our program sponsors. Tony will be back next week hosting an episode on May 18th with Gavin Henning and Darby Roberts talking about assessment in student affairs. And then in June, my good friend Dr. Keith Edwards will be guest hosting for me while I spend a month on fellowship in the Netherlands. And he will be discussing with a panel the topic college men and masculinity. So more details on that episode coming soon. You can receive reminders about these and all of the other great shows on Higher Ed Live by subscribing to our newsletter, as well as browsing our archives at higheredlive.com. And we even have an iTunes podcast if you want to listen to us at the gym. So I'm Heather Shea Gasser. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Thanks again, Corey and Megan. Great to talk with you. And we hope you make it a great week.